Cynthia, right now I see the, oh,
There we go. Sorry.
all good.
Figure out how to unmute myself in the share screen mode.
Oh, gotcha.
Sorry. Okay. Try again. All right. Do you see the right presentation
Uh-huh.
mode? Okay, perfect. All right. Apologies for that technical snafu. So thanks for having us both. As Evan just introduced us, I'm Cynthia Randalls from UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory, and my colleague Erin Tullis is here as well. So today we're going to give you an overview of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0 from Erin, and then I'll follow on with an overview of the Methane Alert and Response System. But before we get started, I just wanted to point out that both OGMP 2.0 and MARS are activities under the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which is part of UNEP. IMEO was established to drive drastic reductions in methane emissions through data. And so we have other activities under IMEO that are equally important. We sponsor various science studies across the world, including a lot of the controlled release studies that Evan has worked on in the past. And we also have an arm that works on implementation and engagement, especially with companies and countries, to help them bring data into their work on mitigation of methane. So with that, I'm going to send it over to Erin, and then when she's done, I'll come back with an overview of Mars. And Erin, just let me know when you want to advance.
Fantastic, thanks. All right, click on. So I just want to kind of start with pointing out that maybe the most important thing of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership is the P, and that's the partnership. And so we're a partnership of oil and gas companies, all segments, upstream, midstream, downstream, and by downstream, I mean distribution, as opposed to like refining or petrochemical manufacturing. And so I think we're up to 113 companies. We expect to exceed 120 by the end of the year. And our companies are tiny and big, from national oil companies to large integrated international companies to really small and in many cases single asset distribution companies, or even really small single asset upstream companies across the world. If you click on to the next. Here's just another snapshot of some of our logos. You can find the rest of them on the OGMP website. So if you go to the next. And at its core, the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership is a partnership of companies that have all agreed to increase the granularity and comprehensiveness of their emissions reporting, covering all of their operated assets and non-operated assets, following a measurement and reporting paradigm that incorporates 5 different levels of reporting, where notionally in the United States or in Canada or some of the countries with more advanced emissions inventory programs, companies already start off at kind of a level 3, where emissions inventories are already built at some sort of generic emission factor basis, already accounting for the various sources, counting up pieces of equipment in the field, various activity factors, and estimating emissions on those bases. Whereas other parts of the world have maybe never started their emissions accounting practices. And so there's a different starting point in the journey for all these companies across the world. But everyone has agreed to get to an endpoint of gold standard reporting, which is levels 4 and 5, meaning that each company asks themselves for all of their material assets, if level 3 or lower isn't really a good and accurate representation of my emissions, how can I sharpen my pencil using measurements and asset-specific engineering models and asset-specific emission factors and any combination thereof to represent my most material emission sources more accurately within each of my material assets? And then ultimately moving into level 5, the question becomes, once I've built a more robust and asset-specific emission inventory from the bottom up, how can I validate that I don't have outstanding unknown unknowns? So this is kind of at the core of what OGMP Gold Standard is going for. We talk about level 4 plus site level measurement with reconciliation. Now, the word reconciliation can be a bit loaded. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so let me take a moment just to be a bit specific about what we mean about measurement reconciliation within the context of OGMP. We're using site level measurements to offer a different perspective, kind of a systems view, if you will, of the emissions at an asset level that help us understand if we're significantly over or significantly under, or again, have sort of unknown unknowns. It's, in my mind, a fool's errand to try to build some sort of emission factor or more generalized inventory from the bottom up, and then make some sort of set of measurements or maybe even some sort of like continuous measurement from a totally different perspective and try and reconcile those by making those numbers match, because each has really different sources of uncertainty. The bottom-up inventories are going to have their uncertainties associated with the way the various emission sources are represented and extrapolated and annualized. And similarly, the site level measurements also will have their own uncertainties, going first from some sort of atmospheric observation, applying some sort of model to convert that to an emission rate, since most emission sources are not metered, and then trying to extrapolate that to some sort of longer annualized time period. And so as you build up those uncertainties, those numbers end up being on such disparate bases that the value of trying to make them numerically match is probably diminished significantly. However, every operator that I've ever known, and in fact, the measurements I've made myself have led to the following, and that is, if you go out and you look, you're going to learn something. And so we've embraced a philosophy of continuous improvement, where we start with our better informed bottom-up inventory, this level 4, which generally is describing emissions source by source by source, and now asking ourselves what we can learn by changing that perspective and bringing in this alternative view of our emissions that will help us find things we may not have recognized we needed to account for, or figure out that some understanding of an emission source or an operating mode is really different than we thought. So again, using it more as an opportunity for continuous improvement rather than some sort of academic exercise in numerical matching. And so we together have this measurement reporting verification set of protocols, if you will, that are more principles-based than rules-based, appreciating that they need to apply to over 100 companies across the world at different starting points with very different assets across all the different segments. And then leverage the collection of those companies and their varied experiences to bring that information together and help everyone accelerate their knowledge of methane emissions and how to make solid measurements of them collectively. So you go to the next slide, please. From the time an operator joins until the time they're expected to achieve that gold standard level 4 or 5 reporting, there are a number of years. Again, recognize that everyone starts at a different point. So for example, if a company were to sign up today to join the OGMP, their first report would be due next year, May 31st. So the year after they've signed up. And then they have 3 years to achieve gold standard reporting for their operated assets and 5 years for their non-operated assets. Gold standard is not just the endpoint of achieving that level 4 or 5, but also the journey to get there. And so companies are awarded gold standard in those intervening years prior to years 3 and 5 for their operated and non-operated assets, respectively, by developing an implementation plan that shows a credible basis to achieve the gold standard reporting for their operated and non-operated assets on time. If you go to the next slide, please. Generally, there are 3 requirements for companies to be a member. They have to define and disclose a methane reduction target that's no further out than their 5th year of reporting. They need to submit this implementation plan that I just described, demonstrating their pathway to the gold standard on the time frame within the program, and then report annually on their methane emissions for both their operated and non-operated assets. Now, not all of that data becomes public. Cynthia mentioned at the beginning that the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership is one of the pillars into the International Methane Emissions Observatory, and that's true. However, that data is first anonymized and aggregated to provide that base data layer within the IMEO. The only publicly reported data that's identifiable for an operator shows up annually in this company fact sheet, which is produced as an appendix to the annual IMEO report. And in that company fact sheet, where an illustration of that is shown here, we report the declared reduction target of the company, the total emissions aggregated across all levels, across all sources. And here you can see this emissions weighted half donut that shows the visual representation of the emissions weighted levels of reporting. So you can have a sense, the more levels 4 and 5 that half donut is filled, the more reliable that total emissions reported number is. And so this is how we can kind of track progress against gold standard and whether or not the company has achieved gold standard pathway for that year, what segment they're reporting into, et cetera. And so there's generally some sort of company narrative. The companies provide that. The information on the left-hand side of the sheet is the assessment of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership team of the company's emissions that were reported into the program. We do have a team of nominally about 6 of us that review all of the data that are reported, the methods to ensure conformance with the reporting framework, and provide feedback to the companies. It is the company's opportunity to continue to improve their data. We are not an organization that's keen to differentiate companies. We're not trying to decide who's good and who's bad. Instead, we're trying to help elevate the entire partnership up to a better understanding of their emissions. And that's because our theory of change is this. We believe that operators, if equipped with better information about where their emissions are, that they would make better decisions and more cost-effective decisions to mitigate those emissions. And so by equipping operators source by source with actual emissions understanding, they're able to make those mitigations. I think my personal passion for this program is led by maybe 6 or so years ago. I was in the position to kind of take over methane detection, mitigation, and measurement within a business. And my question to the business taking over was, do you want me to identify reduction opportunities for your inventoried emissions or for your actual emissions? Because they're going to be different sources. And the inspiring response I got at the time was, well, we want to reduce actual emissions, but we sure would like credit for it, appreciating that sometimes in regulatory reporting frameworks, you can make very significant actual emissions reductions, but if the reporting framework does not incorporate some way to be credited for that, it doesn't show up. So for example, if you go do advanced detection technology surveys of all of your equipment and you find these extra super emitters and you eliminate them, there's not always an opportunity to illustrate that in a generic emission factor basis. And so this is a program that is considered the gold standard of global MRV that allows you to find your actual emissions, quantify them, and then get credit for the actual reductions. Next slide, please, Cynthia. Thanks. And then kind of the last point I wanted to touch on is the governance of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. There's a steering committee that's the formal governing body. This includes all members, as in the company members, but also non-company members, such as the European Commission, the Environmental Defense Fund, Clean Air Task Force, United Nations, and everyone has a vote and all decisions are taken unanimously. So this steering committee meets from time to time, at least 2 times per year, and makes decisions by consensus, which means we can't move the goalpost for participating companies without concurrence from all of the participating companies. Similarly, participating companies cannot lower the standard in any sort of way without concurrence from all of the other counterparties, such as the Environmental Defense Fund and Clean Air Task Force. And within that tension is kind of where the magic happens. There are a couple of mirror groups where company representatives get together without the rest of us and can discuss their really specific implementation problems more openly than they might feel comfortable doing in front of folks like the European Commission or the EDF. And then technical guidance documents are built by technical task forces, which then collaborate with the mirror groups to make sure that input from all of the various company members are taken into account, and then technical guidance documents are approved by the steering committee before they are published on the website and set up as final. I think that's the last slide on this one. So thank you. Glad to take any questions. I saw one pop up in the chat. The company fact sheets are sort of on the OGMP website. Each annual IMEO report is on the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership website. in the section on reports. I think it's called reports and other. It's pretty easy to navigate to. And the appendix for each of those includes all of the company fact sheets. Thanks so much. Back to you, Cynthia.
Thanks, Erin. All right, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about another project under IMEO, the Methane Alert and Response System. So MARS, as we like to call it, was launched at COP27 with the goal of helping countries to achieve some of their objectives under the Global Methane Pledge. This is kind of the first global system that is trying to connect remotely sensed very large emissions of methane around the globe to a notification process that informs stakeholders, including companies and countries, about those emissions, and then tracks how any mitigations put in plan impact the observed emission. So we usually talk about MARS when we call 4 components, which you see here on this slide. The first component is detection and attribution. This is the part where we're actually using the satellites. And importantly, for MARS, we're mostly interested in finding the large leaks, so detecting them and localizing them to the facility scale, so we can actually attribute a particular emission to a particular facility and thus a particular operator. We do quantification of the plumes that we find. However, that's not the main goal. The main goal is to try to find them and then inform the stakeholders of their existence and then track progress towards mitigation. The second component is the notification process, which I'll talk some more about in a moment, where we notify and engage both companies and countries. And the third component, this is where we turn it back over to them and ask them to basically, mitigate the emission that we've observed, but also provide us feedback about that emission. What was the cause of it? And what did you do? Sorry, it automatically advanced for me. Let me go back. Okay. And then the final component of MARS is sort of a circular learning and collaboration to improve the system, but also to track emissions from locations that we've observed in the past to make sure that they remain non-emitting in the future. So for component 1, detection and attribution, we're using the existing suite of global methane detecting satellites, which you see here on the figure and right from Daniel Jacobs' 2022 paper. The satellites we're currently using are in color and also underlined in blue. And they include both global mapping satellites as well as high resolution satellites on sort of the bottom curve. We use a tip and cue approach to detection, where we try to identify sort of regions of interest using the global mapping satellites. And then we do further analysis with the high resolution satellites, because you really need that high resolution to be able to do the localization and attribution at the facility scale. So we do this work in partnership with a couple groups, Esron in the Netherlands, Kairos Incorporated out of France, and UPV in Spain. And we also have some internal capacity, especially on detection with the hyperspectral imagers, such as Prisma. So this is just kind of, an example of what we do. So we start off with something like on the left from Tropomi, where you can see something's happening, but you might not know exactly where because of the large pixel size of Tropomi. But it gives us an idea of where to go look. And so then we will take higher resolution satellites like Sentinel-2 and Prisma to try to map what we've seen in Tropomi to actual facilities. And then you might see something like on the right, where you have a couple of different plume detections in the same region at various facilities. Then using this information combined with public databases of operator information, but also information from countries themselves and or from other companies, we can determine facility ownership. And that's when we enter into component 2, the notification process. So we have a 2-step process where as soon as we're able to localize an observed methane plume to a facility, we notify the stakeholders in all cases, we notify the government, usually through something like the Ministry of the Environment, but it depends on the country. And if we determine or suspect that the emission is coming from a facility owned by an OGMP 2.0 member or one of their no JV partners, we will notify the OGMP 2.0 company. We then ask that the notified parties, both the countries and the companies, as soon as possible, provide an acknowledgement that they've received our notification, and also provide us with any initial feedback they might have on the observed emission, such as if they knew it was already happening because of a planned operation, for example. We then come back about a week later with any additional analyses we have from the satellite, such as an estimate of the emission rate and the uncertainty. And also if we have a suspected potential source, such as like an unlit flare. We give this second notification report both to the governments and the companies simultaneously if we know the company. In some cases we don't, and the government usually provides that to the company for us. And then we move into the third component, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Just as a note, for component 2, we work along with partners at the IEA and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, who help us to identify especially contacts within governments with whom we can engage on these Mars notifications. So in component 3 of Mars, we ask that notified stakeholders respond to the notification and take action. And so it's really in their ballpark, of course, to take mitigation actions. But we do encourage them to share with us both their findings as to the root cause of the emission, as well as any progress towards mitigation. And this, we believe, helps them to demonstrate their commitment to action. If requested, we can put them in touch with various partners that can help potentially provide any kind of technical guidance or assistance, potentially deploying and sharing best practice documents, and maybe even financial support in the future. We're working on that with various partners. And then the final component of 4 is really just about the system improving itself over time, but as well as our data policy, which I show here. So Mars has a data policy that for any given observed plume, after 45 to 75 days, the data will become publicly available. This hasn't happened yet because we're currently in a pilot phase until the next COP, but after COP, we'll open up our data portal and these data will become available. So the data that will be publicly available include all the satellite data that we take, so all the plumes essentially, as well as the data that goes along with that, such as an emission rate estimate and uncertainty. We'll provide a summary of the company and country response, such as did they reply to our notification, yes or no? And did they give us any feedback, yes or no? And if they provide a description of any kind of mitigation actions they've taken, we'll summarize that within the portal. In addition, you'll be able to see if any future events happen at that same location within the portal. And this all is in support of IMEO's objective to provide open, reliable, and actionable methane emissions data. We also believe that having this data available, as well as the company and country responses, allows them to demonstrate leadership in reducing methane emissions and their commitment to best-in-class operations. And so I think that's it. And so thank you, and we can both take any questions.
I have a question.
Yes.